Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Jennifer Ukebu from Human, and I'll be your moderator today. We're going to have an interesting conversation and learn a lot about the new browser script requirements in PCI DSS 4.0 with our PCI expert, Troy Leach, who is Chief Strategy Officer at Cloud Security Alliance, Mr. Jeff Mann, PCI QSA, and Jeff Zitomer, Senior Director of Product Management at Human. So without hesitation, it would be great if you could each introduce yourselves and briefly talk about your experience in relation to PCI. And as tradition at Human, I have to also ask you, who is your favorite human? So let's start with Troy.
All right. Well, thank you, Jennifer. So Troy Leach. I'm with Cloud Security Alliance as their Chief Strategy Officer. It's a nonprofit that works on frameworks and research around protecting cloud, anything that runs on cloud. So a lot of work on AI at the moment. My background with PCI DSS is I was there 20 years ago and was with the PCI Council as their Chief Standards Architect and Chief Technology Officer from the very beginning of the Council, even predating it, and was there for a total of about 18 years between American Express and PCI directly. And favorite human, I'd say I'm in Disney World, so that's the background that you see right here. And I will say that right now it is Vivian from Guest Services at Disney that brought me a MiFi so that I could actually be connected to this webinar so we can speak.
And Mr. Jeff Mann?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I have been in the information security business, or what we now call cyber security, for over 40 years. So I sort of cut my teeth at the National Security Agency for the first quarter of my career or so. I've been involved in PCI pretty much as long as Troy has, but from an assessor perspective primarily. So I started doing security assessments of organizations that were accepting credit and debit cards way back in 2004 at the very beginning of PCI. So half of my career has been PCI, mostly as an assessor. I work for a company called Online Business Systems within their PCI practice. The core of our team has been together since about 2007, first at a company called VeriSign, later at AT&T Consulting. And then our boss got the band back together, so to speak, about 10 or 11 years ago at this company called Online Business Systems. So we were weirdly passionate about security and do it in the context of PCI. So here we are. I'm supposed to say my favorite human. I'm gonna defer to my wife because she puts up with me.
Jeff Zitomer. I lead product management for our client-side defense use cases, including security, privacy, and as of late in PCI 4.0. Yeah, favorite human. I guess I'd take a bit from both Troy and Jeff, so I'll go with my wife as well for taking care of my daughter this morning, so I could be here on the podcast.
The good choices. For everyone watching, if you have any questions, just please type them in the comment section, and we'll try our best to answer them during this session, or we'll follow up after. So let's start from the beginning. Troy, I'll address this question to you. What are the new browser script and page header security requirements, and why were these requirements created?
Yeah, so there's two specific, and I'll throw in a third bonus requirement as well. So there's 6.4.3, which is around application integrity. Requirement 6 is all about application integrity and software design. And 11.6.1, which is around the monitoring and looking for any type of anomalies with what we think is supposed to be operating correctly. So they're both focused on online payments. So these are more e-commerce focused, and it's really about being accountable for the information you receive. So the HTTP headers that are received by a merchant or service provider, and also the payment page scripts which are on the consumer's browser. And this is actually a little bit of a scope extension, looking further into what is on that consumer browser. Because over the years, you can see that, and when we first started doing PCI DSS version 4, so our first in-person meeting was in Q1 of 2019. If you look at the span of attacks 2017 to 2019, e-skimming was one of the predominant attacks. So the criminals were starting to say, okay, I need to go further up the stream or downstream, depending on your perspective, and attack the third-party service providers of these merchants. So in a typical homepage, there are dozens, if not over 100, different sources of the scripts that are coming to form this web page. And they're looking at, if I can manipulate some of these other third parties, it would possibly go undetected, because all of this is happening on the consumer's device and then within their browser. So as we were starting to develop version 4, that was top of mind for us, and continues to be a part of threat today. And as I just mentioned, it bears repeating. This requirement does apply to the third parties. So it's not something that you can just easily say, oh, my third party has managed it. There's accountability that comes into place, making sure that your others that are managing and representing your payment page are actually, whether it's an iframe or whatever it might be, that they are having that type of accountability. So, and just to emphasize, some of that why as we're doing it, the mage cart was probably the face of these types of attacks. Mage cart group was very well known, but it's really morphed and evolved quite a bit since then. So we're seeing all different types of attacks. And I did mention a bonus requirement, and I would say that in addition to the integrity and design of the software and the payment pages for requirement 6.4.3 and the monitoring of the receipt of these HTTP headers, the third one is the policy to make sure those two things are in place. So I would say that requirement 12.5.2, which looks at making sure there's accountability of how everything continues, the data flows through the organization. They're understanding the accountability of all the different pieces of what that architecture looks like. That also is part of it. So those would be the three requirements that I'd probably call out. And I see this being something, the one last point, and then I'll defer to my colleagues here, is these requirements are new. And so typically within the PCI Council, we would always design a sunrise for new requirements that would take time to think about the methodology for implementing these type of new requirements. So the sunrise for these will actually, PCI DSS version 4, you can use it right now. It's the only standard effective just in a few months in March of next year. These new requirements, they're giving people time to understand and adjust and apply the right controls. So this is the great time to start. If you've got your 2024 budget planning cycle, this is the great time to start thinking about this, because these new requirements will, among about another 50 odd requirements, will go into effect March of 2025.
Thank you so much. That was a really in-depth overview. You touch on the accountability. So I'm going to ask Jeff Mann, are there any circumstances where merchants can remove their payment pages from the scope of the new PCI script requirements?
Well, the short answer is no. But what you're touching on really is sort of a tendency or trend within the PCI ecosystem, as I call it, where merchants largely have for many years tried to look for ways to, let's say, minimize the amount of effort that goes into meeting on an annual basis, or demonstrating that they're meeting on an annual basis all the PCI compliance requirements. And one of the key ways that they try to do that is in terms of this concept that we call scope, which is largely misunderstood and misapplied, in my opinion. But essentially what scope means in the context of PCI is what systems, what applications, what hardware, software people and processes are in any way, shape, or form involved in primarily payment card processing. Mostly merchants and retailers that are accepting payment with credit and debit card for payment of goods and services. One key misunderstanding is if they can involve a third-party service provider to sort of take on the responsibility for a lot of the activities that are required in PCI, a lot of times merchants think, okay, that's out of scope. And I have many clients that I am continuously correcting. No, it's still in scope. You just have a third party meeting the requirement. That's different from here's a whole set of systems over here that have nothing to do with your payment acceptance or your engaging in e-commerce, and therefore those systems don't have to be looked at from a PCI perspective. I would never say that they don't need to be secured, because that's a whole different can of worms. But because these new requirements are focused primarily on e-commerce, I think it's important to point out that very often the way e-commerce merchants are minimizing their responsibility for PCI is by involving a third party or a set of third party service providers. And that could be entities that are hosting their websites and their e-commerce sites. There could be entities, and this is the primary method, a third party that takes care of the payment page, the actual collecting and asking for the payment card information, address, and all that in order to complete the transaction. And that's the big one. There can also be third parties that are involved in the website development and administration and upkeep. So, I have merchant clients that do very little in terms of their e-commerce, because they've outsourced the functionality of their e-commerce site to 3-4 different providers. So I think it's important to point out with these new requirements who's going to actually be responsible. And Troy already commented on something that I find fascinating, and this is something that we were talking about in the previous week leading up to this presentation. When you look at strictly the PCI data security standard, these new requirements are the way Troy describes them. It's focusing at the payment page. What's interesting, though, is there's a lot of merchants out there that report their PCI compliance because they're not as big as the big guys. They're considered smaller merchants, and so therefore they do this self-assessment questionnaire process. These new requirements are showing up in the version of self-assessment questionnaire, which is A, which is primarily focused on e-commerce merchants and e-commerce only. In the SAQA, where these new requirements fall, they actually stipulate that these requirements are not focused necessarily on the payment page itself, but on the web server that is offering or presenting, and to use PCI speak, either redirecting or serving up the iframe that sends the browser traffic, the consumer over to, and they don't see it necessarily, but to a third party, where the payment page is actually served by a third party. So even in that context, I think it's important as PCI 4.0 is coming about, that all merchants understand what their responsibilities are and what these new requirements refer to in terms of not only the payment page, but in some contexts, the web servers that are redirecting to the payment pages. And I anticipate much confusion, frankly, as over the next couple months, as more and more merchants, start looking at version 4. Because despite everybody's best efforts, most merchants, most organizations wait to the last minute, wait till they have to do version 4, which comes next year. One more small caveat. No, I'll save that for later. I'll let you guys move on to the next question.
So Jeff, that was really good. And on that last point and some of the confusion, the SAQs, just to add, I speaking to my former colleagues at the PCI Council earlier this week, I think it was, or last week, and they were talking about they hope to have some clarifying FAQs, I think at the end of this year, and then also into first quarter. So I think there is some additional guidance coming from the PCI Council on these, because I absolutely agree with what you said, that there's going to be confusion, and just like most people, when we did our homework back in school, they're going to wait to the last minute to. I mean, I'll just speak for myself. I did it at the last minute, and so I can understand when others did that too.
Well, I'm curious, Troy, and not to sidetrack, but because you were part of the council for so long, when these new versions came out, there was always, as an assessor, a point where you read it and you try to understand it, but you don't really see the nuances until you're actually really assessing very often. And there was usually something, sometimes more than one, one requirement, one area where there was this sort of, what were they thinking? What was the council thinking? Or there's this apparent disconnect or confusion. I mean, it's hard to avoid. I always wondered if it was intentional or not, or if it was accidental. But
no,
but I guess that's my question.
Just to answer real quickly, and we'll throw on to Jeffrey. But I think there was always that need to have flexibility. So you don't ever want to be so firm in any of these requirements that you don't allow for innovation and technology to advance, a payment industry to be able to accept new forms of payment or other types of innovation. So right. I think there was in the early days, probably the first 4 or 5 versions of PCI DSS, I think someone coined the term in our group, prescriptive ambiguity. So that there was enough that you could test and verify that what the intent was. And I think what PCI DSS 4 has done is what we tried to do back in 2008 and 2010's iterations, but I think they've done it more successfully, is be able to articulate, because remember, it used to be the navigating PCI DSS document that was incorporated into the standard itself. There's a lot more about the spirit and intent that's actually in the document, so you didn't search, because I think in the early days, I think there's a lot of confusion, like what was the intent, what was the impetus for this, and so that's when we decided, I can't remember which version, 2010, 2012, somewhere in there, actually brought in the navigating PCI DSS document. And now with the customized approach, there's an ability to not only look at what the intent was, but say, we have ways that we are avant-garde with some of our security practices, and we can actually take and apply a new means to address those requirements. So I think, as everything, it like fine wine, just only age helps it improve. So I think that's what we're starting to see with version 4.
Gotcha.
Oh, thank you very much. That's excellent. Really detailed. Jeff, you commented on the e-commerce merchants. I would like to ask you about the level 1 merchants as well, actually. Are they eligible to use PCI self-assessment questionnaires?
So what has been allowed for the last several years is for larger merchants that have to do the full-blown report on compliance and have to have a third-party assessor such as myself come in and evaluate how well they're meeting all the requirements. It's become very common, especially in really large merchants. Think international, if not just nationwide, where there's thousands of locations, retail, brick and mortar, but they also have e-commerce, and maybe they also have other different areas. It's pretty common for and it's allowed for retailers to sort of divide up what's called the payment acceptance channel. So if you can isolate the e-commerce out of the rest of the operations, and again, often it's because it's outsourced to third parties, you're not eligible to fill out the SAQ, but you are allowed to use the SAQ requirements that are found in this case, SAQ-A, as sort of a guide or a template for what requirements are applicable out of all the PCI requirements for that particular payment acceptance method, in this case, e-commerce. So they can essentially use the SAQ as a template or guide to say, out of all, I don't know what the current total is with version 4, 500-ish requirements, only these 50, 60, 70 requirements apply to this specific payment acceptance method. So they're allowed to only respond to, in context of e-commerce, to those. So think of it as a template or a boilerplate or a guide on what are the applicable requirements for a specific type of payment acceptance method. And that's how large merchants can still use the SAQ, which is why the confusion needs to be sorted out. Because there's some that only do one or the other, but there's a lot that kind of use both the ROC and the SAQ. So I'm not surprised at all, Troy, that guidance is coming, because it kind of has to come, frankly.
And thank you. That's good to know, and I think also brilliant for our listeners to know as well that the additional guidance is coming out. So for Jeff and Zitomer, what options do entities have for addressing these browser requirements?
Yeah, so just to echo the prescriptive ambiguity, as somebody who's reading those requirements, translating those into product requirements, and then explaining them to customers and answering customer questions, I find myself constantly going back and finding yet another layer of that prescriptive ambiguity. And that kind of leads into this question as well of how to address the requirements. The standard does help with a lot of different examples, but it doesn't say, for example, which example applies to which part of the requirement, and whether any one of them or a mix of them address the requirements better than any other mix. So when you look at those, generally speaking, they fall into three buckets. You have your natively available in the browser, in the typical just HTTP standards, requirements like content security policy and sub-resource integrity, or CSP and SRI. Then you have synthetic scanners, or the ability to use a synthetic scanner. And finally, real user monitoring with an agent running in the browser. And so when you think about those, so for the first category, CSP and SRI, they're great because they're proactive and they're free. Just very quickly, CSP basically means that you have an allow list of which domains your browser or your user's browser is allowed to engage with or load scripts from, and it can either just report on that or enforce that. And then SRI means that you're literally putting a hash around, or providing a hash with your tag for the script, so that when the script is loaded, the browser can compare the script to that hash and just basically fail and break your payment page potentially if the two don't match. And so the issue with the great thing about these two, again, is that they're proactive and free, but the problem is they're very complex to manage, because websites and browser scripts coming from third parties across the internet, they change all the time, outside of the control of the website owner. Then it's very blunt and brittle, and sometimes the end result just becomes that your CSP policy grows and grows, or SRI could fail silently, basically break your page and not even let you know. That, let's say, they're great tools to have in the box, but they're less than ideal for most customers, certainly the ones that do rely on a lot of scripts and are much more dynamic type sites. And of course, none of these will give you that script inventory and everything you need to do around maintaining that inventory and justifying everything that you have there. The next category for the scanners, so you're basically setting up a recording of a user session on a browser to replay over and over, and then capture what scripts is it seeing. Those are, they're nice and convenient because they're completely unintrusive. They'll give you an inventory. It won't be a complete inventory, but an inventory of the scripts that it has seen, and potentially some information about those. The problem is that inventory is going to be very incomplete because it's just what was seen during that recorded session. And also setup and maintenance of this could be complicated, because you may need to update that recording every time it breaks, or pay someone else who has people who constantly do that for you. And they're easy to bypass, because a script can know that it's actually running not on a real user, but on a bot. Like, for example, our whole company specializes in telling bots apart from humans. In this case, this is typically actually a lot easier. And so a malicious script can know that it's a synthetic scanner right now and not a real user, and just basically behave well. And the last point is that it only will give you monitoring. So it'll help you meet the requirements, yes, but now it tells you you have all these problems. Now you can't really take action because it's completely outside of the application. It can't block anything. It can't really help you remediate or tell you too much about what to do for next steps. And so the last category that we believe is best and aligns with our approach to MageCart from a product we launched about 5 years ago is this real user monitoring option of having that one JavaScript that can rule them all running in that browser, and then for every end user, so real browsers of your real end users, literally to the letter of PCI, that can see on every real user what are the scripts that are actually getting loaded, what are all those scripts doing, so you're not assessing, okay, do I know this vendor and has the script changed, yes or no, but you're actually looking at, is this script reading payment page fields? Is this script opening an iframe? Is it doing anything else that's risky? And then provide all that intelligence to the customer with, of course, the inventory, and let the customer make those decisions and be able to take the next step, and in some cases even precision block the exact risky behaviors that you don't want while still keeping that script there. And so that could help a lot of the customers, a lot of the merchants that are going to have these potentially debates between the security and compliance side of the house and the marketing side of the house of, hey, this script is doing dangerous stuff, we got to remove it, but then the marketing side saying, no, it drives like 30% of our business, we can't take that out. And the ability to block the very specific risky actions that you want, or put in place a proactive policy that if it sees certain risky behaviors, then block those as it sees those, could give you the confidence and enough de-risking so that you can keep both parties there happy. And finally, also, because that script is there and just deployed and can gather and see everything that's there, it doesn't actually take any kind of setup and maintenance. Because once you put that JavaScript over there, it discovers everything on its own, sends back everything that it sees, and then you're just viewing it in the browser, auto-discovering all the scripts, auto-discovering even all the payment pages. You don't need to tell it anything in advance. You don't need to reconfigure it. If your site changes, if your vendors change, if your developers added or marketers added a lot of scripts without telling you, it'll just discover all of those as they happen.
Okay, great, thank you. So just to be specific, and I mean, you've spoken about the complexity of managing the scripts, and then in terms of how to manage it, you were talking about the human product in terms of how it secures payment pages in compliance with these requirements. Is that what it was, Jeff?
Yes. So if you look at those examples and say, okay, how do I address the requirements with them? So so we have the three categories. So you just understand pros and cons of each. And then within that last category of the real user monitoring, which we believe is the best one, then yeah, our product within it hits all of those potential pros and cons is something that we recommend looking at as you evaluate us and other vendors in that space.
Okay, great, thanks. I just wanted to slyly
Thank
slip
you.
that one in.
So sly.
Yeah. So thanks so much. We did have two questions that came in recently this week. So I just think we've had a really good conversation here, but I think they will help provide further clarification on the browser requirements. And one, I think I'll address it to Jeff Mann, is what are the three aspects of 6.43?
Sure. I mean, as we've been alluding to and talking about so far, 6.43 being a new requirement is focusing on the scripts that are part of a web server to be determined whether it's just the web server or just the web payment page aspects, but it's basically looking at the scripts that are loaded in a consumer's browser. So the scripts that are launched, if I'm the consumer at Acme toolcompany.com and I'm trying to buy a hammer, my whole experience in my browser is being provided to me through a series of scripts, as has already been addressed. The three specific requirements in 6.43 are sort of tied back to sort of classic data security concepts: integrity, availability, confidentiality. That doesn't necessarily apply in this sense. It does in an overall sense. Let's not lose any of our personal data, including credit card data. But 6.43 is simply, number one, saying you need to have an inventory of all the scripts that are in your website that are being launched or potentially launched by a consumer on the client side. So that's number one, an inventory. Number two is all those scripts that you have available, make sure that they're authorized, make sure that they are the scripts that are intended to be used by your website, the whole experience, and are intended to be loaded by your consumer, your customer that's bringing this up on their side. So that's authorization. They are intended to be used. The third aspect is what they're referring to as integrity, and that's again a data security term that has to do with whether the script in this case has been modified, altered, attacked essentially in some way where there's some unintended action or unintended result that comes from using this script. And that really speaks to the e-skimming and the mage cart based type of attacks that Troy was talking about earlier, where these scripts, because nobody was looking at them, could be modified and enhanced, as it were, for the bad guys to be able to do nasty things, which primarily means stealing, because they're harvesting one at a time, what we're calling e-skimming or electronic skimming, payment card information, because the client doesn't know that there's some enhanced functionality on this script that's collecting all this data, even though that data is still passing on to the actual legitimate e-commerce server, and I'm still buying my hammer from Acme tool company, but the bad guys have also collected all my information. So inventory, just a list of all the scripts. Integrity, are they the scripts that you intend to have out? Have they been altered in any way? And authorization, are they the ones that are intended to be used? Those are the three elements of 6.43.
That's brilliant and really helpful. Thanks so much. I guess on that final point of authorizations, I'll ask Troy, how should merchants think about automating the authorizations? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, they should be thinking a lot about this. So I think Jeff's done, both Jeffs have done an excellent job at just talking about how complex our environments become. And so there's a lot of dependency on CSPs, so not the content security policy that Jeff was talking about earlier, but cloud service providers and all these SaaS providers and third parties are helping to support our e-commerce infrastructure. I think so. Automation is going to be incredibly important going forward. It's something I've preached for many years at PCI because I could see, and now that we have Gen AI and major leaps that are happening every week. If people didn't see OpenAI's, just some of the radical things that they've already been able to do, and what I thought would take them 2 or 3 years, and they're doing it in a matter of months. And so with that, our attack surface is going to increase, not just from the architecture we have, but we have things such as Worm GPT, Fraud GPT, where all these people that have no technical background whatsoever can go in and create code for, and scripts that actually will disrupt and create these type of threats. And so it's really important to be thinking about, hey, I don't want to just check a box for PCI and show my assessor, someone like Jeff coming in, that hey, I have something in place. I have a manual thing in place that will satisfy the requirements. I think we really need to be thinking about how dynamic the threat is, how dynamic the environments are, and as such, just automation is in my opinion, because I can say it now, is really mandatory if you really truly want to address the underlying risks that are growing at a significant pace.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. We have got a question in the comments, so I did want to, I think I'll address this to Jeff Mann. I think it's in reference to your comment on SAQA. And the question we have here is, why don't we just use D and call it a day?
Yeah. Hi, Christopher. How you doing? Full disclosure, I know Christopher. The reason why everybody just doesn't use SAQD and call it a day is because it's the questionnaire version of the full PCI data security standard, and most organizations are looking to do the least amount of work possible. So there is the potential for having to respond to a lot of requirements that technically do not apply for whatever their payment acceptance method is. I mean, as a security professional, I think everybody should be following the data security standard, no matter what your organization is, whether you take payments or not. It's and has always been a very decent overview or framework for how to do data security or information security in an organization to protect whatever type of data that you have that is valuable, that you don't want to have stolen or altered or modified, and always have available to your clients and your organization. So in that sense, yeah, everybody should do SAQD, but the short answer is you don't have to, and that's why people don't.
Well, and I'll add one thing, because Jeff, you said this earlier in our talk, and I think it's important to maybe just emphasize it, is there, with especially a lot of these merchants, they could be mid-size merchants or service providers, and they may be using different acquirers for different parts of their payment acceptance. And so their e-commerce merchant bank may be different than those that are doing acquiring for their on-prem locations. And as such, then that transaction level goes down. And to Jeff's point, if I could do less, I'm going to. At least for validation, right? But we emphasize that to what Jeff ended with, SAQD that's covering all the controls. Merchants are still, even if they're completing SAQA, technically their merchant agreement with whoever acquiring bank that might be says that if there's a compromise, they're supposed to be demonstrating to all of those requirements, and that's an important point to emphasize. Is sometimes we've seen smaller merchants that thought they only had to do what was in SAQA, and the reality is that they had to actually adhere to all. They just had to demonstrate a much smaller subset.
Yeah, it's funny that you brought that up, Troy, because I was going to mention that in the old days, I mean, you're referring to service agreements where merchants and entities are subject to all of the data security standard. That used to be written into the SAQs, and I'm not sure exactly when that language was pulled out, sometime in the version 3 iterations, but I used to rely on that by telling my clients, just because you think you're doing this shorter version doesn't mean you're not on the hook for all of it. It used to be in the SAQs at least, but it apparently isn't there now for whatever reason. But that's a sidebar conversation, probably.
I wanted to add that just a general recommendation for these two specific requirements, the 643 and 1161. It's highly recommended that also level ones and assessors look at the SAQA, because it actually has a more useful guidance language about scoping and why these requirements are in scope, also when using that iframe and redirect language that unfortunately as of now isn't in the main requirement or in the SAQD.
Well, on that note, there was a question that popped up asking, well, what does this apply to? Is it your whole e-commerce app, or is it just the payment page? And I think the answer is to be clarified, hopefully by the end of the year, with probably an FAQ from the council, because there is sort of at this point mixed messaging. Primarily due to what is stated in the data security standard itself, and what is additional detail is provided in the new SAQA.
Yeah, and that's an important point, Jeff. Is that there should never be perceived a difference. So the SAQA is supposed to be a reflection of value for small merchants, and so I think one of the things I've heard consistently from the PCI Council is probably going to be some clarity to assure people that there is not a difference. It's just that there was clarification provided in one source for the validation document, the questionnaire, and so I think that will be part of I would assume that would be part of it.
Right. Looking forward to seeing it.
Thank you very much. There are a few questions that have come in, and I don't know if Jeff Zitomer, maybe you want to follow up with them, and it's just talking about the product specifically. I know one of the questions was about the 6.43 relate just to the payment pages or our website, but obviously there are options with our there are options with our product, so you can discuss that separately. But I think just to wrap things up, this has been a really great conversation, and actually we could keep on going, definitely. But I think it would be great to hear your final thoughts before we wrap things up. What advice would you give to merchants, payment service providers, or assessors? Let's start with you, Troy. We've got 2 or 3 minutes. We've actually gone over, so we'll do this quickly.
Yeah, and Jeff and I can attest. You get a couple bourbons in our hands, we can go for hours on PCI DSS. I think for me, it's been understanding the challenge of going back to the automation and the need for this software bill of materials and just this expectation that we know all these third-party elements that are touching our payment environments and how it's, again, just been very complex. So I think where they start is looking at ways that they can get their hands around what is my true inventory? How do I assure that as it is dynamic and always changing, how do I maintain and monitor that in a dynamic way? And automation seems to be and there's a lot of different ways to do that. And then I'll get just another push for Gen AI. I think there's a lot of security elements that are coming that are going to alleviate the overburdensome types of validation checks. I think we're in the infancy. I think it's got a lot of maturation to go, but I think we're going to see a lot of help from Gen AI. It's going to help a lot of bad things, but it's also going to have a lot of phenomenal good things as well.
Mr. Jeff Mann?
I could say so many things, but to organizations that fall under PCI, I would highly encourage you to approach the standard as a framework for how to do security, data security, information security, cybersecurity, whatever you want to call it, sufficiently in your organization to minimize, not that you're ever going to be breached or compromised, but to minimize the impact and hopefully detect it early, which necessarily involves the minimizing or leads to minimizing the impact. I think we're foolish to believe that we're never going to get breached, that we're never going to get compromised. We're foolish to believe that we can outsource the responsibility and the liability associated with any type of security breach to a third party. It really falls back to sort of personal corporate responsibility and accountability, which unfortunately, despite the council's best efforts to try to involve entities, merchants, and service providers of all sizes, not everybody gets that messaging and embraces that. So I would encourage everybody just to take a serious look at the security aspects of PCI and less focused on how do we minimize our requirements, de-scope, push it off to a third party, but really embrace it for what it is.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so speaking as a product manager, right? So my goal is to build a product that just makes the requirements, not only helps you just secure obviously your site and the payment pages, but makes meeting these requirements as easy and simple as possible through like auto discovery and just automation of authorizations and anything else that could be automated or simplified in order to meet the requirements. But I'd like to sort of be a responsible vendor here and point out that like no tool is going to solve either your security or compliance problem on its own. There's a lot more that organizations are going to need to do, that we're trying to build our tool to best support that, and that is still putting in place the policies, processes, training the people, and then of course evaluating and deploying a tool. And if you think about the 18 months that we have left, then that is not a lot of time to accomplish all that. If it's a large enterprise with a lot of different business units and control that's not all centralized in the company necessarily, this may be quite difficult. And so I'd actually put a plug in for watching a talk that I gave at the PCI Council in Portland about a month or two ago with Stephen Eric Fisher, where he talks through charting out that course for a large enterprise, from just digesting the requirements, analyzing them, planning out how you're gonna meet all of this in time and get done in time everything that you need to do, including of course the tool evaluation and the policy development, etc. Then executing against that plan, and then okay, once you've met the requirement, then you have the all right, reflect and improve, continuously improve, and see what you could do better for next year.
Thank you very much. So we lost Troy, but luckily it was right at the end and he gave his amazing advice. Yeah, we've just had a technical glitch, but I'm very happy it's right at the end. But I just want to thank you both, and obviously Troy, for doing this. It's been a great conversation. Like I said, we could probably carry on. I want to thank everyone also who joined us and is listening and watching today. If we didn't get to your question, we'll come back to you via the comment, or you can contact us directly. I'm sure we'll be doing something again very similar, talking about PCI. So I just want to say thank you very much, and yeah, have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.